oversight. These programs were developed to assist the nation's smallest firms. Instances where ineligible businesses and entities, including political organizations who benefited from the programs, must be examined closely. Take, for example, the over $300,000 taxpayer-backed loans that were received by the Ohio Democratic Party in May. And Madam Chair, for the record, I would oppose such a bailout for the Republican Party as well, but it happened to be the Democratic Party in Ohio that took advantage of this, and I don't think it was ever intended for that type of thing to happen. Additionally, oversight of how well the billions of dollars allocated to assist small businesses was utilized is imperative. That will help us to formulate a future strategy and to make well-informed decisions that benefit the greatest number of Americans. I happen to represent most of the city of Cincinnati. For the past few months, I visited with countless small businesses and obviously many of their employees as well. And I and my staff have spoken with representatives from the Cincinnati African American Chamber of Commerce and the Urban League. Some of our smallest businesses, particularly those in minority and economically disadvantaged communities, oftentimes the smallest businesses and typically under 10 employees, they didn't, when this started, and many of them still don't, they didn't have the strongest relationship with banks or credit unions when they were seeking these loans. So I think that it's something that we, and I know as this has evolved, and the chair has been instrumental in that effort as well, and we've worked with her and her staff on that. But we have to make sure that those folks in these economically disadvantaged areas have access to this, because as I say, oftentimes the relationship they've had with the banking institutions, financial institutions, just isn't there. So it makes it even tougher for them. Now, it's impossible to legislate from Washington for every single situation across the country. Likewise, it's impossible to regulate from Washington for every scenario that may come up. All of the folks in this room recognize this and have been reminded since March of that structural impossibility. Congress acted quickly earlier this spring. Speed was paramount in getting funds into the hands of small business owners to keep them afloat when they were forced to shut down through no fault of their own. Consolidating 6 months of legislative work in a little more than 6 days, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats working together, and it was signed into law by President Trump on March 27th. This more than $2 trillion economic relief package delivered on our commitment to do everything possible to protect the American people from the public health and economic impacts of COVID-19. The CARES Act created the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. Following passage of this landmark legislation, the SBA and the Department of the Treasury worked tirelessly to execute the law and issue regulations to inform borrowers and lenders alike how the program would be administered. To the credit of everyone involved, the first loans flowed from private lenders 7 days, just 1 week later on April 3rd. Since that date, the PPP program has distributed nearly 5 million loans to small firms in the amount of over $500 billion. In my district and the surrounding area alone, small businesses utilize the program to preserve nearly 500,000 jobs. These successes cannot be ignored, and Ohio isn't alone. This program provided small businesses and their workers a lifeline across the entire nation. Were there bumps in the road? Of course. As I stated earlier, it's very difficult to get a program this size up and running in a week. Have there been communication issues between the federal government and the lenders and the borrowers? Undoubtedly. But that is one of the reasons why we're here today. We must examine and learn from the past and prepare for the future. Unfortunately, there are still challenges that are presenting obstacles for the nation's smallest firms. Because we continue to face this threat, we must be forward-thinking. More needs to be done, and we have proven that when we work together, across the aisle, across the Capitol, and across the different ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, we can move mountains. We aren't done yet, and I look forward to engaging with you, Madam Administrator, and you, Mr. Secretary, as well as you, Madam Chair, as we continue to work for American small businesses. I want to thank you both for being here, and again, thank the chair for holding this hearing today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chabot. I'd like to take a moment to explain how this hearing will proceed. Each witnesses will have 5 minutes to provide a statement, and each committee member will have 5 minutes for questions. Please ensure that your microphone is on when you begin speaking and that you return to mute when finished. With that, I would like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is the Honorable Jovita Carranza, Administrator of the SBA. Administrator Carranza has an inspiring background. Born in Illinois to an immigrant family from Mexico, she began her career at UPS as a part-time employee, ultimately climbing the corporate ranks to become president of Latin America and Caribbean operations. In 2006, President Bush named her deputy administrator for the Small Business Administration, and most recently was the Treasurer of the United States. Welcome back to our committee, Administrator Carranza. Our second witness is the Honorable Stephen Mnuchin, the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury. Mr. Mnuchin has a successful career as a banker at Goldman Sachs for multiple decades before leaving to join other hedge funds throughout the 2000s. He was appointed Treasury Secretary by President Trump, where he has served for the last 3 years. Welcome to the House Small Business Committee, and thank you for joining us today, Mr. Mnuchin. Administrator Carranza, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you.
The mic is not on?
It says green and talk.
Okay. Maybe bring closer to you. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Now.
Okay, now.
Right.
Thank you, Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Chabot, and members of the committee for the invitation to testify this morning. I'm eager to update you on the progress that has been made by the agency in helping small business weather the coronavirus pandemic. Since March, the SBA has processed more loan volume than it has in the entire 67-year history of the agency. As of this morning, the PPP has approved nearly 5 million loans for over $518 billion in much-needed fiscal relief to America's small businesses. We administered this first-of-its-kind program with an eye toward equity, recognizing that this pandemic has been particularly harmful to socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. We mobilized thousands of new lenders, including community banks, credit unions, fintech companies, farm credit lenders, and hundreds of CDFIs and MDIs that specialize in providing liquidity to underrepresented communities. Through economic injury disaster loans and EIDL advances, the agency has reached over 8 million small businesses, dispersing nearly $170 billion in assistance. That amount is more than all other disasters combined in the history of the agency. EIDL loans are currently being processed in just 5 days, with disbursements occurring in just 2 days. These programs help the small business sector survive once-in-a-lifetime disruption. Since early June, I've made a concerted effort to personally speak to businesses left reeling by this pandemic and to financial institutions so that I can see for myself what is working and where improvements need to be made. One of the scores of business I visited was an African-American logistics management firm in Dallas. SBA loans provided him with a bridge, a financial bridge, over the most tumultuous waters he's ever experienced. It helped him not only keep his employees on payroll, but also hire new workers who received comprehensive skills training and professional certifications. Many small business owners use that term, bridge, to describe how SBA loans provided them with time and the space needed to rethink, innovate, and to adapt their business models for success in this new environment. One African-American manufacturer in Greensboro, North Carolina, told me that an SBA loan helped her develop brand new lines of revenue online. SBA loans helped a whiskey distiller in Traverse City, Michigan, transition his manufacturing operation to hand sanitizer to meet both a social need and financial gaps. This pandemic has been an impetus for innovation in the small business sector. But, Chairwoman, it also has accelerated modernization at the SBA. For example, we've created an internal oversight plan for each CARES Act program, and we've looked long-term at our management responsibilities for millions of businesses and disaster loans. The agency has brought on thousands of staff to support our COVID disaster operations while simultaneously servicing 175 natural disaster declarations. We've significantly corrected the customer service experience for idle applicants by accelerating processing of our loan queue, helping them to better plan. Our dedicated SBA professionals have been working hard to achieve this largely on telework status, and as a result, we are more nimble, more responsive, and better prepared for tomorrow. Before I conclude, I want to say a few words about the PPP data disclosure made earlier this month. The data reflects information about loans approved by lenders and entered into the SBA loan system by those lenders. It does not mean that SBA has determined that a borrower has complied with program rules or is eligible to receive a loan and forgiveness. We are reviewing all loans. Moreover, we have provided the opportunity for business or lenders who believe that their reported information is inaccurate to contact us, and we will work with them to fix it. At the same time, we should not lose sight of the fact that this unprecedented program has emerged as one of the most successful and consequential federal economic response efforts in history. That success is the result of a collaborative effort that includes the White House, Treasury, SBA, the lending community, chambers of commerce, and importantly, each and every one of you. I know that there is more work to be done, and we all share the same goal of helping small businesses across the country. I look forward to working with this committee and other members of Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator Carranza. Mr. Secretary Mnuchin, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Chabot, and members of the committee, I am pleased to join you today to discuss how the Department of Treasury and the SBA are working together to provide relief to business and their workers through the PPP. We remain committed to working together until every American gets back to work as quickly as possible. America's economy continues to recover from the challenges posed by COVID-19. For the second month in a row, the jobs report vastly exceeded forecasts with a record of nearly 5 million jobs. This brings the 2-month gain to approximately 8 million jobs. While unemployment rate is still historically high, we are seeing additional signs and conditions of improvement. The Blue Chip report is forecasting that our GDP will grow by 18% in the third quarter. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce reports that 79% of small businesses are at least partially open, and half the remaining businesses will open soon. Retail sales rose by 18% in May and by 7.5% in June. But let me point out, June was actually 1.1% higher than the same June 2019. This is a result of all of our programs working with Congress. Investors and businesses have historically high cash positions and are beginning to put them back to work. We are in a strong position to recover because the Trump administration worked with Congress to pass legislation on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis and provide liquidity to workers and markets in record time. In particular, the PPP is keeping tens of millions of employees in their jobs. Economic impact payments are helping millions of families. We are monitoring economic conditions closely. Certain industries, such as construction, are recovering quickly, while retail and travel are facing longer-term prospects. We are sensitive to the fact that certain areas of the country are experiencing increased numbers of cases. The task force working with state and local officials is helping to ensure that people can work safely in this environment. We look forward to continued conversations with this committee and other members of Congress to address these critical issues. Turning to the PPP, the SBA and Treasury worked together to launch this in unprecedented time. We approved over 5 million loans for $517 billion to support the employment of over 50 million jobs. This is truly an extraordinary achievement, and we are pleased that the loans were broadly distributed and made across diverse areas of the economy. with 27% of the funds going to low and moderate income communities, which is consistent with the proportion of the percentage of the population. As you might expect, with a program of this magnitude executed on a national scale rapidly, we initially experienced some complications. We resolved them quickly. To implement the program, our teams work with members of Congress on a bipartisan basis to issue rules and guidance to provide clarity. By standing up the program quickly, we were able to support tens of millions of jobs. We have worked closely with members of Congress in both parties to pass 3 subsequent pieces of critical legislation. We also reached a second round of funding for over $300 billion. I look forward to these continued bipartisan efforts. A next phase of relief should extend the PPP, but on a more targeted basis for smaller companies and those that are especially hard hit, such as restaurants, hotels, and other travel and hospitality business. The Treasury Department is implementing the CARES Act with transparency and accountability. We've released a significant amount of information on our website, reporting on usaspending.gov and updates to Congress. We are cooperating with various oversight bodies. Regarding the PPP, Treasury and SBA regularly released data. On programs, the Treasury and IRS have made data information regarding millions of economic impact payments available on their website and to the GAO. We are pleased that the Treasury, working with the Federal Reserve, has announced to add to existing disclosure on the liquidity facilities by posting additional information on the website. Chairman Pell and I have had productive discussions with the members of the Congressional Oversight Commission. In addition to the PPP, we had 160 million payments for the economic impact payments. We've made massive amounts to support air carriers. We've had $150 billion to Coronavirus Relief Fund. The Federal Reserve facility is up and running. I'm pleased to announce that Main Street made its first loan for $12.3 million to doctors' offices consisting of 15 practices in Wisconsin. The lender was Starion Bank, a family-owned $1.2 billion community bank. There's a $50 million construction loan, which will save over 3,000 jobs in the working. I look forward to working with Congress next week on a bipartisan basis to pass additional legislation. I'd like to thank the members of this committee for working with us to help the American people, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Secretary Mnuchin, ethics rules were waived administratively in the PPP, allowing friends of the Trump administration to get access without any further review. Meanwhile, there are thousands of small businesses, many owned by women or minorities, and located in rural areas that were desperately seeking assistance. Were you concerned about those optics?
Well, let me just say, as it relates to certain loans that the administrator said, there will clearly be loans that are reviewed for appropriateness. But let me just comment on the conflict of interest rules. I had very specific discussions with Senator Schumer and McConnell on the conflicts rules, and it relates to the direct loans from Treasury and the loans from the Federal Reserve. There were very specific requirements and certifications that were required from members of Congress and the administration. As it relates to the SBA program, Congress could have included those same requirements but decided not to do so. And indeed, the SBA followed their standard provisions for the SBA. The SBA Standards Conduct Commission determined that the PPP loan should be governed by similar disaster programs. And explicitly, and again, this was a committee that did not consist of political people, explicitly decided to provide the same waivers that they've done for other programs. So again, we look forward to working with oversight committees to make sure that proper rules and regulations were followed.
Well, I welcome that, and we intend to exert our responsibility and our constitutional duty to be at the table. I am the first minority female chairing a committee, and when we are discussing lending programs that are within the jurisdiction of this committee, I will demand for the ranking member and myself to be at the table. I insisted that ethics rules should not be waived. These are lending programs. If it's good for the 7A and 504 and SBIC, it should be good for this type of lending. And I will insist on that when we sit down to discuss going forward. I understand idols were capped at $150,000 in an effort to stretch the funding. However, I asked you, Administrator, the appropriators asked you, and the Senate asked you on numerous occasions if you needed additional funding, and the answer was not. Yet, here we are, and it is our small businesses that are suffering. Moving forward, you must work with us, and I ask that you remove the cap for new idle loans immediately and allow those with existing loans to obtain the capital they deserve. You still have $200 billion of loan-making authority left in the idle program, while small businesses are hurting. So help us help you, because members of this committee and businesses who came to testify before this committee, they said that they might remain open, but will not be able to keep those businesses open, because when they were thinking that they would apply for the maximum allowable loans, then you reduce to $150,000. We need to do better than that. This is not going away, and too many businesses are suffering. Mr. Mnuchin, the pandemic has caused the rate of Black-owned businesses to drop by an astonishing 41%, and the rate for Latino-owned businesses by 32%. These numbers are unacceptable and are only going to get worse unless we act now. Amid reports, shouldn't we set aside a percentage of the remaining funds for small businesses that need it most? I just heard you saying that you are going to ask for hotel, restaurant, the traveling industry. What about minority businesses?
I agree with you. There should be a set aside for small minority businesses.
Thank you. Thank you. So I can count on your support that we could set aside funding for mission-based lenders, because, you know, we are discussing here the smaller of the small businesses who have no connection, who has no pre-existing banking relationships with those financial institutions. Those who have relationships are mission-based, like CDFI, like MDI, like micro lenders. And I hope that we could, going forward, work with you on that issue. My time has expired, and now I recognize Ranking Member Steve Chabot.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator Carranza, I'll go to you first. Given the overwhelming response to this emergency, is the SBA prepared to respond to other disasters such as floods and hurricanes and fires? We know they're coming at some point. Are you all prepared for that?
Yes, Mr. Chabot. At this point, we have about 3 type disaster declarations that are being submitted by the governors. It's either economic disruption based on civil unrest, or it's natural disaster, and then, of course, the March declaration of economic disaster. So we're processing all 3 as we speak.
Very good. Thank you. Secretary Mnuchin, I'll move to you next. Does the loan forgiveness process need to be simplified anymore? For example, I know there's some members of Congress that have suggested perhaps even forgiving all the loans under $150,000, for example. I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't do that, but I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts about it. I've heard a lot of concerns from folks out there about how complicated the forgiveness process can be. If you could talk a little about that.
Well, we look forward to working with this committee and the Senate Small Business Committee to simplify the process. There were provisions in the existing act that made it complicated. We tried to issue as much guidance as we could. I know one of the things we'll talk about is, should we just have forgiveness for all the small loans? I think that's something we should consider. We should obviously make sure there's some fraud protection, but we look forward to working with this committee and others.
Thank you. As you know, at this point, there's approximately $130 billion that's still in the PPP program. So everyone's talking about, so what do we do with that? Do we reduce the number of employees eligible from, say, 500 down to 100, or do we stick with what we have? Do we do a second PPP? And I know these are negotiations that everyone is having now, including the administration, the House, the Senate, this committee, and others. What are your current thoughts about that?
The administration supports using the existing money and topping it up with some additional money, and that will be discussed, and allowing for a second payment to the businesses that are especially hard hit. And Chairwoman, let me just say, I was only giving examples of businesses. I didn't mean to any way imply that those are the only businesses that are hard hit. I think this time we need to have a revenue test and make sure that money is going to businesses that have significant revenue declines. That's something that Congress didn't have in the first provision. So, but make sure that the businesses that are especially hard hit, particularly small businesses, and put in certain safeguards. So some of the types of people we saw that took out loans, and I look forward to working with Congress. If Congress wants to put back in the conflict rules, we're more than happy to work with Congress. The administration supports, we will participate on the same basis of the House and the Senate.
And let me, Secretary Mnuchin, also one of the things that you all were operating under impossible time constraints. We passed this. I was at the signing ceremony on a Friday. The next week, the loans were literally going out the door, although not that many, and it wasn't glitch-free. We all know that, but you all got your act together pretty quickly and saved a whole lot of businesses all across the country, and God bless you all for doing that. And this committee was involved in it, many others as well. But I know one of the things that was frustrating, and again, I don't want to be critical here, but was frustrating, I heard this from lenders, I heard this from small business folks, I heard it from our staff, was just the time it took to get the guidance out so people knew what the rules were, what we were all operating under. Do you have any thoughts for the future as to what we might be able to do with
Sure. Well, let me say, in one of the more ridiculous statements I've ever made, I committed we get the program up in 2 weeks. And working with the SBA and the staffs, we were able to do that. Now, obviously, in doing that, it ran into a lot of issues, but we made the judgment. It was more important to get it up and running quickly, that sending money to people 4 months later wasn't going to help small businesses. Now that we have it up and running, especially to the extent there are minor changes to the PPP and the EIDL programs, working with the SBA, we can get the guidance out very quickly. We won't have the technology problems we had last time. And again, I would encourage this committee to work in the context of these programs and put more restraints. The other thing I think you should consider on the EIDL is, now that we have Main Street open for loans above $250,000, that we really do focus EIDL on loans that are $250,000 and below.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now we recognize the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Finkenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing. And so just for the Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary Carranza, for you guys to understand, the district that I represent is in Northeast Iowa. It has 3 bigger city centers, and the rest is pretty rural. And our district has been hit very hard on a number of levels, whether it's been the attacks on our agricultural community over the last few years, or now this pandemic and how it has affected not just our cities, but also our rural areas as well. And one of the things I want to touch on, Secretary Mnuchin, I know you brought this up, but really want to dive into this, are those economic impact payments. Those direct assistant payments that are important for individuals who are worried about how are they going to pay their mortgage, their rent, put food on the table, but also for our local businesses as well, who have been able to stay open, to have some sort of economic stimulus here during this pandemic. And one of the things that I was really concerned about is when these went out to folks, obviously, if they had their direct deposit set up, those went into their accounts, most of them. However, we heard from 700 people within my district about these payments who did not receive them, or they received them, but they were in the debit cards and didn't realize that they were these economic impact payments. And so why was this set up the way that it was? Why was there no real communication out to these districts, out to folks who needed to understand how these were coming out? And then also, I know we wrote you a letter, actually, Secretary Mnuchin, about the fees and reissuing these cards because so many folks were throwing them away. I'm glad you listened and decided to waive that $750 charge for replacing, but why does it cost $17 to priority ship these cards to folks? Why do taxpayers who need their money now have to wait longer and it costs them more? This is just something, again, that needs to be dealt with, and I'm glad you fixed a piece of it. But what are we going to do down the road when hopefully we issue more support to folks and actually have that education? And why was this done in the first place?
Well, thank you for your comments. And let me just say, the fact that there were 700 of those in your community is inexcusable. And if you have specific issues, we're happy to follow up. I would say the IRS and fiscal services did an extraordinary job in sending out over 150 million, again, in a record period of time. The debit cards, you did point out something. We didn't realize that the debit cards were sent in unmarked envelopes. We will correct that going forward. I do think the debit cards actually was an interesting addition for two reasons. One, it allowed us to get payments out quicker since we could only create so many checks. And two, going forward, debit cards.
I'm sorry, Secretary Mnuchin. How long did we have to wait to put those out because the president decided to have his name on those checks or on the paperwork that went out with those?
I can assure you there was zero delay associated with either one of those issues. It had no impact on the timing. We were limited in the number of checks we could print per week, but that had no impact on it. And I think the fees were waived. If the fees weren't waived and you have constituents that still have issues, again, I'm happy to follow up on that.
Yeah, the fee of $750 to replace was waived, but then there's the $17 that cost for the priority shipping of the cards.
You let me know and we'll follow up. That should be waived as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And then I also have a question about the PPP program. Obviously, this has been incredibly important all over the country and in districts like mine. But I have to be honest, I was really disappointed at the beginning when this rolled out. I mean, we allocate these dollars and then they go to these agencies. So they go to SBA, they go to Treasury to set up how these are doled out. And communities like mine, quite frankly, were left behind because we have the highest concentration of community-based financial institutions in the entire country within my district. And so the first batch essentially went to big banks and people who were connected with their banks and left out communities like mine. Did either of you think about how this would impact our folks who lend with community-based financial institutions? Why was this done the way that it was at the very beginning? And how can we ensure, I know we have that set aside now for those dollars, but how can we ensure that as we continue to look at this, that we are doing what we should here with these agencies to make sure we don't forget about rural areas? I mean, on the SBA, I understand as well that we lost the head of rural affairs during this. Actually, she got moved. I know we're short on staffing to deal with this, but not the time to move somebody that represents rural areas.
Time has expired. If you wish to answer the question, sir.
I can assure you we are very focused in making sure that the community banks and the CDFIs have equal access, and you're correct. Unfortunately, there were issues in the beginning. We corrected it very quickly.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both for being here today. My first question is for the Administrator. Thank you again for being here today, Administrator. I greatly appreciate your leadership through this pandemic. I would also like to convey to you that your local office in my district, Columbus, Ohio, SBA, has been a phenomenal partner and resource for me. We have been doing a back-to-business tour for the last 3 weeks. Everett Woodell from your office has been with me along the way, and his team, and we're very grateful. And to see the business owners that encounter the SBA while we're there and to put a face with the name is very pleasing for them as well. So thank you. An issue that I've heard more and more about from my constituents is the lack of clarity on PPP forgiveness. Specifically, I hear this often from business owners looking to have their businesses bought out. This could be because of the pandemic or a planned sale prior to COVID-19 that's been placed on hold because of the virus. In this situation, the business owner took PPP in order to support their employees, and now they cannot sell their business with this forgivable loan on the books. Why is this?
Thank you, Congressman. This is a situation that I'd have to speak with you personally or and address the particular case, because this is news to me about them taking a PPP and then wanting to sell. It's not a new incident where small businesses that are ready to sell because they don't care to go through another pandemic or another crisis. They're in a position and interested in selling their company, but the PPP or the idle loan issue was not raised when we had those discussions. But I have experience similar to you that there are businesses that are ready to sell. But I'd have to look into, and I'll concur with the Treasury on how to manage that situation where, in the forgiveness, we haven't addressed that at this point. Okay. An entity wanting to sell their firm and they have a loan.
We will work with you on that.
Yes.
In the business, one, for example, that I've been in communication with, they were doing an exchange in January before the pandemic hit. So this is, most of them that I've been in contact with have been having this issue before the pandemic even started. So we will work with your office and address that. Thank you very much.
Look forward to it.
Mr. Mnuchin, thank you. My next question is for you. I've introduced legislation with my colleague from across the aisle, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, that would provide a tax credit for small businesses to purchase and install PPE and related safety equipment. This legislation would help small businesses that are suffering financially under the weight of mandatory closures be able to afford the personal protective equipment required to reopen their doors. Are you open to working with myself and Ms. Lawrence to ensure small businesses are safely prepared to welcome customers again?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not familiar with the specific legislation, but I like the concept a lot.
Appreciate it. It's up to $25,000 tax credit, so thank you. Look forward to that. Administrator, back to you. If a business owner decides to use personal finances, monies that's not associated with their business, to pay off their PPP loan in order to move forward with the sale of business, they just have to eat this as a loss? And again, that may be something that you and I may need to sit and discuss.
Yes, I agree. I have to understand all the nuances to that particular situation.
Understand.
And also perhaps there's other businesses that may be facing the same thing that we need to look into.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Secretary, my last question is for you. I greatly appreciate your leadership. I mean, it's been fascinating to watch you. As we look towards the next aid package, much of the focus seems to be on providing aids to schools, hospitals, and first responders. I support these efforts, but also believe we must continue consideration of America's economic engine, small business. And I know that Madam Chair and Ranking Member Shabbat have both talked about this. What types of considerations for small businesses and workforce development efforts are also being considered? And I didn't leave you much time, Mr. Secretary.
Various items, but again, I think that's something that should be considered, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, I yield back my remaining time.
The gentleman yields back. Now we recognize the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Golden, for 5 minutes.
To get the schools open and the children back to school. But always remember that safety and the health of the children and the teachers comes first. And I think if we keep that in mind, we'll go a long way to getting the schools open safely.
We were, it's a summer of intern And there's always a summer of interns. We're all trying to help our interns have different experiences this year, given how complicated the virus has made it. And we have an intern who asked the question, are schools ever going to go back to normal, to the way that they were?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, we're going to get over this. You know, it seems, you know, we've been going through this very difficult period for the last 5.5, 6 months. And sometimes you get so exasperated and run down by it that you think it's never going to end. It will end. It will end through public health measures, and science, I can tell you, will come to our rescue. Hopefully sooner rather than later. We're going as fast as we possibly can with the development of therapeutics and the development of a vaccine, which, as you know, we've been speaking about a while. We got some pretty favorable results in early studies of vaccines. One of the candidates will be going into an advanced phase 3 trial by the end of this month, by the end of July. And other candidates will be entering advanced clinical trials as we get into the midsummer, late summer, and early fall. So we feel cautiously optimistic that we are on the road, as bleak as it may sound right now, that we are on the road of getting this under control. So you can tell your intern, yes, we will get back to normal with schools, and we will ultimately get back to normal with every other aspect of our lives.
That's a wonderful thing, I think, for us all to center on and to make us all more serious about masks and social distancing and washing our hands, because there is a normal on the other side, and probably the sooner we can interact appropriately, the better. You know, that's an optimistic note. Let me ask you a question on another optimistic note, which is we hear a lot about how the virus has impacted business, but it's also true that business has impacted the virus. And so you just talked about vaccines. We know there are therapeutics and there are other things, but can you talk a little bit about the role of the private sector in fighting this pandemic?
The role of the private sector is paramount. The federal government, academia, is part of the private sector. Pharmaceutical companies are part of the private sector. So every single candidate, therapeutic, diagnostic, and certainly vaccine that we're dealing with right now and trying to develop has a major input from the private sector. So there's no way government alone, be it a federal government or state and local government, is going to fix this. It's a marriage and a collaboration between government authorities and the private sector. It has always been that way. It is that way now. And I believe it always will be that way. So the answer to your question is absolutely the private sector plays a major role.
You mentioned, and the Chamber is obviously a firm believer in that and the role of the private sector and how important it is, but also how these public-private partnerships across a lot of society's challenges are so important to success for all of us. And speaking of other partnerships, we have another question from the audience from yet another sector. You mentioned academia. We have a question here from Enid Raymer, who I think is at Johns Hopkins.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Fauci. My name is Ina Chung Raymer. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute for Health and Productivity Studies from Johns Hopkins. My question is, how can the business community best help achieve public health priorities in improving the public health infrastructure needs to manage the current crisis?
Well, you make, a good point. I'm expecting that coming from Hopkins that you would do that. And that is, I'll put in a plug here for something that I want everybody to appreciate, is that one of the most important aspects of responding to an outbreak are both the healthcare infrastructure locally and the public health infrastructure locally. It becomes very, very difficult to adequately respond, including things like identification, isolation, contact tracing, if you do not have an adequate local public health infrastructure, manpower, and capability. And unfortunately, in some respects, historically, we have been the victims of our own success because we've done so well in containing, controlling, and even eliminating some of the big killers and maimers and diseases that cause a great degree of morbidity over the decades and decades, that we have, maybe declared our success too prematurely and let the local public health capability kind of dwindle a bit. So that's something we need to build up now, but we need to remember in the future that if we want to respond adequately to an outbreak, we really need to make sure that our local public health apparatus is very much intact and very vital and very ready to respond.
Well, that makes me want to ask you 12 questions. I'll try to limit it to one at a time here. You mentioned the importance of the local infrastructure and the domestic infrastructure, but as we're seeing these global pandemics, of course, there's an international infrastructure, and there's been a lot of conversation about the World Health Organization and why it's important that the United States have a connection with these global health organizations. Can you explain that?
Well, I think if you look at the meaning, the Latin-derived meaning of pandemic, it's pan meaning all. So when you're dealing with an infectious disease, this is a global issue by definition. There are very, very few, I think Ebola may be one of them, where you have an infectious disease that just by the nature of the disease itself is combined geographically. But when you get a respiratory illness, which most pandemics are, influenza, COVID, respiratory illnesses, then by definition, you're global, particularly in the 20th century, 21st century, where we in fact wind up being able to travel from one part of the globe around the world, 180 degrees around in 18 hours. So you have to look at the global connectivity. And that's the reason why organizations that are global in nature, as well as the public health security networks that we have put up, are so important, because we are all connected, and we need to be connected and be transparent. We need to be connected to exchange information, and we need to be connected in our response. Because if you have something like a COVID-19 outbreak, if it's smoldering in another part of the world, we're vulnerable here. I mean, we saw that absolutely when it emerged in a well-defined geographic area in China, and then all of a sudden, the entire world with more than 220 countries have been involved. So that's the answer to your question. It is global by nature, so we need global organizations and global cooperation.
The other thing your earlier answer made me think about is you mentioned the successes we've had in combating other diseases, and it made me think about how important immunity is to that at some point. And so these questions about COVID-19, and I know that we don't know the answers, but what do you think the odds are that people could get reinfected, that you could get this virus over and over again? And how does that change how we treat this particular disease?
Well, first of all, we don't know the answer to that question. You're absolutely right. We can make some extrapolations based on a long backlog of knowledge of other viruses, that if you get infected and you recover, which almost by definition means you've made an adequate immune response against the virus and recovered from the virus, and that virus does not substantially change, so it's the same virus, that the chances are that at least for a finite period of time, and we don't know now today what the definition for finite means. Is it 3 months, 6 months, a year? We don't know that yet. We're learning that, but we don't know that yet. You can assume that you're going to be protected for some period of time after you recover. The question that we need to know for the purpose, for example, of vaccinations, is how long does that protection last? Because it will guide us to get the optimal vaccination. I mean, you vaccinate someone, you hope you get a response that protects them for X amount of months or years, you hope. Likely we'll be able to do that. If the immunity wanes the way immunity does wane with some infections and with some vaccinations. The response is you do something like give a booster shot, which is something that is not that difficult to do. So you need to be aware of the potential finite nature of protection, but there are also multiple ways that you could overcome that and respond to it.
Yeah, I mean, we're all used to getting boosters, right? I mean, that's something that happens as we vaccinate our children and ourselves, and you just learn how often you need them. That becomes part of of how you take care of yourself. We have another question coming in from Hope Cupid in Virginia.
Good morning, Dr. Fauci. My name is Hope Cupid, President and CEO of Southeast RCAP. My question for you today is, why is COVID-19 impacting Black and Brown people disproportionately, and what does this demographic need to know to better protect themselves? Thank you.
Thank you, Hope, for that extraordinarily relevant question, because this is a real problem that we're facing. So if you look at the data, what you said is absolutely correct. If you look at minority populations, particularly African Americans, Latinx to some extent too, Native Americans, that there are two things that go on with them that make them bear a disproportionately more serious burden of COVID-19. And that is, even though you don't like to generalize, but in this case, generalization makes you understand it better, that in general, the kinds of jobs and the kind of economic strata in which minority populations, particularly African Americans, find themselves in, put them in a more vulnerable position to get infected. It's less likely, by the jobs that many of them have, that they're able to protect themselves by being at home, doing work through telework, looking at a computer and being safe in your own home. Generally, they are disproportionately more out there, exposed in situations where they may not be able to prevent themselves from getting infected. So their risk of getting infected is likely more. Not major studies, but they get infected more. So therefore, you can make a reasonable assumption that the risk they have of getting infected is more. Then the important issue that's more problematic because it's going to take a much longer time to address and fix, and that is the social determinants of disease, the things that go into making someone have a higher incidence of diabetes, of hypertension, of obesity, of asthma, of any of a variety of illnesses, which we know if you do get infected and you have one of those underlying conditions, that the chances of your getting a serious, deleterious, negative outcome of getting infected is much greater than if you didn't have those underlying conditions. So when you look at the African American and the minority population in general, they have a significantly higher incidence of those underlying conditions that lead to a poor outcome. So when you put those things together, greater incidence of getting infected, greater prevalence and incidence of comorbidities, which make your outcome worse, it's entirely easy to understand the data that you just mentioned, that the minority communities are at much greater risk of getting into trouble with COVID-19. You can address some of them immediately by putting resources for better and easier testing, identification, isolation, contact tracing in areas where there's demographic overrepresentation of this minority. So they have easy accessibility to these things to get them diagnosed and into care quickly. We can do that now. What's going to take longer to fix is the decades and decades and decades old social determinants of health, which we must address because they can be overcome, and over a period of time, we can diminish that disparity of these underlying conditions in the minority population.
It's such an important point. You know, one of the pieces of work we do at the Chamber is doing everything we can to support job creators. And we just held a national town hall about what we can do to impact the equality of opportunity, because we know that employment leads to better health outcomes. And so we know that whatever we can do to help people who've been traditionally left out of those circumstances enter and have more opportunity also over the long run helps their health outcome. An issue very near and dear to our heart. You earlier this week talking about issue and saying what will be important is concentrating health resources, access to testing, et cetera, in minority communities in order to really fight this trend. Have you seen any place that's doing that well that might serve as a model for the rest of us?
Yeah, we're trying to do that right now. I mean, if you look at the total response involving FEMA, involving the CDC, the ones that are out there in the field. I mean, I at NIH, we do research to develop therapeutics and vaccines. So we're not specifically out there in the community at that level. But organizations like FEMA and particularly the CDC, who actually has done that, historically for what they do, is to go out into the community and interact with the state and local health authorities to do just what we're saying right now.
I think it's so important, and anything that we can do in partnership with you to highlight the best practices, anything that you're seeing that we can get out to the state and local chambers as they're advising their governors, their mayors, and their communities, we want to help be part of the transmission of those best practices. We have another question, this one from Washington, D.C. If you can roll that question, please.
Good morning. My name is Radhika Chnoy, and I'm with Southwest Airlines in Washington, D.C. I reside in Alexandria, Virginia. So Dr. Fauci, I'm a working mom, mother of 2 young boys, and the last few months, my husband and I have had many sleepless nights because of this virus and what we can do in our communities and in our controllable behaviors. But I was curious to know, Dr. Fauci, what keeps you up at night, knowing that there's still so much that we don't know about this vicious virus?
Thank you for that question. Things like this happening have kept me up at night before it happened. And I'll get to what keeps me up at night right now. But I have always said the thing that I have always been very concerned with is the emergence of a new virus that we've never been exposed to before, that has a couple of characteristics. One of which is that it's easily transmissible from person to person. And 2, that it actually has a significant degree of morbidity and mortality. Because we've had examples of outbreaks that are new infections, but they have one but not the other of those characteristics. And the reason I've lost sleep about that was the concern of what happens if those two come together. So we had the famous bird flu in 2005, which jumped from a chicken to a human, high degree of morbidity and mortality, like 37, 40% mortality, but it didn't transmit from human to human very well. It was kind of like a dead end in one human. So if you're unlucky to get infected, too bad, because you have a high degree of mortality, but it's unlikely you're going to infect anybody else. Then came the 2009 H1N1 swine flu, the first pandemic of the 21st of the 21st century. And what we saw with that was a virus that jumped species from a swine to a human, had a very, very capable of spreading from human to human, but it was pathogenesis was very minor. It didn't kill very many people at all. Then along comes COVID-19 and the SARS coronavirus 2, which is the perfect storm. It has both characteristics. It's spectacularly capable of transmitting from human to human, and it has a significant degree in some people of morbidity and mortality. So that's what up to now. What bothers me the most now is the absolute need to get control of what's going on right now globally. The United States of America has been hit very severely by this. You just need to look at the numbers and see the number of infections in the millions and the number of deaths, 140,000 deaths or around that number right now, keeps going up. Each day we're still seeing increase in hospitalizations. We need to get better control over things, and we need to open up the country, because staying shut down has economic employment, health, and other negative consequences that are significant. So we've got to have a delicate balance of carefully and prudently going towards normality and opening up, at the same time that we contain and not allow these surgings that we're seeing in certain southern states. That's a big challenge. That's the thing that I get concerned about most. How well we're doing about that. Can we do better? And can we turn this around? I believe we can. This will end, but I want to do it sooner rather than later. That's what continually causes me what I would call a relative lack of sleep.
Well, amen to a quick end. You know, I was mentioning to you in the green room that I remember having dinner with you back about the bird flu all those years ago, and remember you specifically saying that this type of outbreak was your worst nightmare. I guess what worries me, not having any of your experience, is that these things that used to be once in 100-year pandemics seem to be coming more quickly together. I mean, we're optimistic that we get to the end of COVID-19, but are these pandemics going to become more frequent occurrences?
You know, I think that, A, they likely are for any of a number of reasons, because we continually encroach a bit, sometimes inappropriately, on the human-animal interface. And if you look at how many of these outbreaks, first of all, if you look at the numbers, about 70% of all the new infections, namely infections that we've never experienced before, are what is called zoonotic. Namely, they're fundamentally an animal reservoir, and for one reason or other, they've jumped species. HIV/AIDS did that, Ebola did that, influenza does that, and coronavirus, SARS coronavirus number 2 has done that. So it clearly happens. What we tend to do is that, as we've seen in China with the wet markets, where you bring animals in from the wild who have these viruses that can be adaptable to human, and you have such a close human-animal interface with no regulation, that can do it. It's also when you encroach upon things like the rainforest, when you go out and build and do building up of civilizing certain parts of the country, and you come into contact with species of animals that harbor viruses that can, in fact, efficiently spread from human. That's the reason why we continue to see new infections. It's at least 70% being zoonotic.
Okay, lots of questions there, but we know the country wants you to get back to fighting this disease. I'm going to ask you 2 quick final questions. One is to look into the camera and give people as individuals advice. We're getting questions in the chat about, should I get tested even if I've been tested before? Should I go see my doctor? It's time for my annual mammogram. Should I go to the dentist? So personal, I know the personal physician, but what are you advising the individuals watching this about COVID-19 testing and about their regular doctor visits?
Right. Well, there really is no reason just to get tested because you want to get tested. I mean, if there is a reason, like you've been exposed, contact tracing, or what have you, one of the reasons if you want to get tested, even though there's no risk that is that to accumulate data as to what the penetrance is. So you could be part of the process where we're doing more blanket testing to understand what the level of infection is in community. But you shouldn't wake up in the morning with nothing different from any other day and say, oops, I absolutely need to get tested. If you want to get tested, there are enough tests around that you can get tested. But there may be good reasons why you want to get tested. And that would be, I think, something to drive you to get tested. The other thing that I think is important is, depending upon where you live and what the status of the outbreak is, for the most part, you should try, if it's safe to do, to continue to do the kind of things that look after your general health. You mentioned routine screening, routine doctor visits, routine procedures like mammograms, oral dental care. The one thing we don't want is for people to stay away from things that later on, because they didn't do proper screening, would lead to infections or cancers or cardiovascular disease that you could have avoided if you got routine medical care. So you want to be careful. You want to do all the things we've spoken about over the last half an hour, 45 minutes about protecting yourself, but you want to pay attention to your normal attention and normal application of things that are important for your health.
I do want to get to a last question, but a quick follow-up on that. If I'm I live in Fairfax County, Virginia. If I want to know what's going on in my community, am I looking at % positive tests? Am I looking at hospitalizations? Am I looking at deaths? How am I judging what's happening in my community as I'm making personal decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said them all. I mean, if you do more testing, you're going to get more positives. But if there are more cases that are going up that are independent of how much you're testing, but the cases are going up, then the percentage of the number of tests you do that are positive are going to go up. That's a surefire indication. Number two, you will see more hospitalizations. And number three, when you have more hospitalizations, inevitably, you're going to see more deaths. Because if people are serious enough to get hospitalized, a certain percentage of them are going to be very sick, and a certain percentage of them are going to die. And that's exactly what you're seeing in certain areas. Fortunately, where you live and where I live in the Washington, D.C. area, things are pretty much under control. But we've got to be prepared that we might see increases, and we've got to be responsive to them and being able to prevent them from becoming serious surges the way we're seeing in some of the states that we spoke about in the beginning of the program, like Florida and Texas and California and Arizona, where they're seeing significant increases.
So final question. Now you gave individual advice, and I'm going to ask you to look into the camera and give a business owner advice. I mean, these business owners are really trying to balance health and their livelihood, you know, the risk of reopening and the risk of staying closed. And so what's your final word of advice to the business community in America?
Well, the final, I don't like to say advice because sometimes that gets presumptuous, but my final reflection on the business community is that the business community is so essential to everything we do, even our health. I mean, to have a healthy community, you have to have a healthy business community. So you are really important. So you've got to try within the framework of safety and attention to your health and your safety and your welfare to try and get back to normal and open America again in a way that's prudent, that's careful, and that follows the guidelines that we spent considerable time putting together, the guidelines for opening America again, with the gateway, the phase 1, the phase 2, the phase 3. Take a look at those guidelines and follow them, because the public health apparatus shouldn't be looked upon as the obstacle in the way of opening. It should be a gateway, a vehicle, and a facilitation of opening. Because if you follow them, it is unlikely you will have to backtrack because of a surge, the way we're seeing going on in several states right now. So if you do it prudently, then I believe you can, in most instances, continue to progress along to bringing back and opening up America again.
Dr. Fauci, thank you for everything you're doing for our country. Thank you for helping us think through these issues today. Please count on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as an information and best practice disseminator at any time that we can be helpful to you. And God bless you in your work. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. Thanks again. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you so much. And to the audience, if you've missed any of the prior episodes, they're on uschamberfoundation.org, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. You heard it from the expert yourself. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and stay safe. Thank you so much for joining us today.